Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. Following the publication of the United States National Security Strategy, which reflects the intentions of the country's President Donald Trump and his team regarding their attitude toward the world surrounding the United States, many in Europe, politicians, observers, and public figures, are genuinely despairing. You only have to see the front pages of European newspapers to understand how truly frightened Europeans are by this strategy. For the first time since World War II, the United States is practically abandoning, at a state level, the idea of Euro-Atlantic integration, the very idea that was the essence of security for both the United States and the countries of Europe for many decades. It was this idea that helped the United States become the chief guardian of democracy in the modern world and withstand the Cold War against the Soviet Union. It was this idea that instilled hope in Europeans for the future. And now, what becomes of those hopes? Well, first, it must be understood that there is no particular sensation in the publication of this strategy. The very conception of how the Trump administration and its supporters would relate to Europe was clearly articulated at the Munich Security Conference when the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, spoke about the new administration's future foreign policy concepts. Second, it cannot be said that, based on this strategy, Europe no longer interests the Trump administration. It does interest them, but a different Europe, a Europe where ultra-right, populist forces should come to power. If you will, a greater Europe of Orban. This is, of course, difficult to imagine. It's like in the 1920s and 30s, the presidents of the United States would have promoted the rise to power of Benito Mussolini or Adolf Hitler. But the truth must be told, even back then, there were many politicians and businessmen in the United States who openly sympathized with ultra-right, fascist, and Nazi ideologies on the European continent and considered it normal for their country, which was then perceived as a model of democratic reforms, to cooperate with Hitler's Germany and fascist Italy. Only World War II, in which the United States fought on the side of the Allies battling Berlin and Rome, practically tabooed the subject of these sympathies and buried the political careers of those who sympathized with fascism and Nazism. However, 8 decades have passed. We see that the inoculation against ultra-right rule no longer works, and not only in the United States. After all, the slogan, "We can repeat it," appeared in the Russian Federation precisely when Russia finally turned into a classic fascist state whose authorities are clumsily attempting to copy the practices of Hitler and Mussolini. Why couldn't the same thing happen in the United States? There is a fairly simple answer to this. Because a fascist dictatorship, or an ultra-right dictatorship in general, is precisely a dictatorship, not a democracy. An ultra-right politician cannot hold on to power for long in a democratic society where elections exist. And for an ultra-right politician to retain power, this is a law of history. First, there must be a complete abandonment of real electoral practices, and second, a large and preferably victorious war. This law of history was perfectly demonstrated by the practices of Benito Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany. This law of history is being demonstrated by the actions of Vladimir Putin. Initially, he leveraged the fruits of the liberal economic reforms in Russia in the 1990s. And then, when the fierce dictatorship of the Russian security services was established, he allowed himself a major war against Ukraine. All of this constitutes elements for maintaining power and cementing the regime. How do you envision a similar development of events in the United States? It is clear that Donald Trump will not be able to destroy electoral democracy, nor is it likely he really wants to. It is clear that a large-scale war involving the deaths of hundreds of thousands or millions of Americans on the battlefield, actions that genuinely could help the ultra-right maintain power, is the last thing Donald Trump would want, as he sees himself as a peacemaker politician who rids America of all sorts of wars. And this is the contradiction. War is the key to his political success and the ultra-right's retention of power, but it is also the biggest scourge for the ultra-right movement, which lives by the idea of the United States' non-involvement in any serious conflicts. Therefore, there is no great need to despair over this strategy precisely because we see temporary figures in power. Donald Trump has no real recipe in his pocket for improving the economic situation of Americans. As is known, that pocket is generally empty for life. And it is completely unclear how the Republicans will continue to win elections if, on the one hand, there is no real economic improvement, and on the other hand, the political views of Trump and his team increasingly diverge from the political views of the majority of Americans. And not just Democratic voters, as we see, there's no need to talk about sympathy for Trump here. But already, many undecided voters are horrified by the political practices of the president and his team. And with the passage of time, more and more Republican voters will turn away from Trump, from Trumpism, and from MAGA. This does not mean that someone new, like J.D. Vance, cannot become the next president of the United States. It's just that J.D. Vance, like any opportunistic politician, will become an anti-Trumpist president who will scourge and eradicate all the practices of his predecessor, just as Nikita Khrushchev once did with his idol and patron, Joseph Stalin, to whom he owed practically his entire political career until he took the chair of the first secretary of the Central Committee of the CPSU. So what conclusion should be drawn from all this? Yes, Trump may want to abandon the Europeans. But the most important thing is that he will not be able to do it in practice. He will not succeed in refusing real cooperation with Europe. The United States will not succeed in becoming genuine allies with neither the Russian Federation nor the People's Republic of China, who are sincerely interested in weakening America's geopolitical influence, and not only in Europe. And not just in the Asia-Pacific region. In Latin America, too. This is not the 19th century now. Everywhere America leaves, China confidently arrives. And we must also understand the pattern of this development. Therefore, instead of beating our chests and being surprised by the fact that the ultra-right managed to come to power in the world's most important country for democracy, we simply need to wait out the trends we are observing on the American political stage and understand that we are, in any case, dealing with political corpses. The important thing is not to perish ourselves before the ultra-right in America turn into political cadavers. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, subscribe to my social media accounts, to the channels on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatella, which help develop all these resources. Use the sponsorship function on YouTube itself. Peace be with you.